There is a rule you followed today that you do not agree with. Perhaps you did not notice it. Perhaps it was small enough that noticing it would have felt like making a fuss over nothing. A workplace policy that seemed to exist for no good reason. A social convention you privately consider pointless. A piece of paperwork you filled out correctly even though you were certain that the information being collected served no meaningful purpose. Or perhaps it was larger, a law you consider unjust, that you nonetheless obey. A professional requirement you regard as bureaucratic theater, a social norm that you think is outdated, but that you continue to observe because the cost of visibly violating it seems higher than the cost of your private disagreement. You followed the rule anyway. This is one of the most consistent and most consequential features of human behavior, and it is far stranger than it first appears. Human beings follow rules they privately reject, with extraordinary regularity, and they do so not because they are weak-willed or unprincipled, but because something in the architecture of human social psychology makes rule following largely independent of rule agreement. Understanding why reveals some of the deepest and most uncomfortable truths about how human societies actually function. Let's begin with the most famous and most disturbing demonstration of this phenomenon in the history of psychology. In 1961, the psychologist Stanley Milgram at Yale University began a series of experiments that would become among the most cited and most controversial studies in the history of the discipline. Milgram recruited ordinary members of the public and told them they were participating in a study of learning and memory. Each participant was instructed by an experimenter, a figure of apparent scientific authority in a white coat, to administer what they believed were increasingly severe electric shocks to another person, actually an actor, whenever that person answered a memory test question incorrectly. The shocks were labeled with increasing voltage, up to a level marked danger, severe shock, and beyond that, simply with an ominous XXX. As the experiment proceeded, the actor receiving the shocks would protest, cry out in apparent pain, demand to be released, and eventually fall silent, as if unconscious or worse. At each point of hesitation, the experimenter would issue one of a small set of verbal prods. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Before running the experiment, Milgram surveyed psychiatrists, college students, and middle-class adults, asking them to predict what percentage of participants would proceed to the maximum shock level. The consensus prediction was that only a small fraction of a percent, essentially only pathological or sadistic individuals, would go all the way. The actual result was that approximately 65% of participants proceeded to the maximum shock level, continuing to administer what they believed were dangerous or lethal shocks to a screaming, then silent, victim, simply because a person in a position of apparent authority told them to continue. Milgram's participants were not comfortable during this process. Many showed extreme distress, sweating, trembling, nervous laughter, and visible signs of psychological conflict. They knew what they were doing seemed wrong. Many voiced their objections explicitly, and the majority continued anyway. What Milgram's experiments revealed was not that human beings are secretly sadistic, or that the majority of people are willing to inflict harm on others without moral qualm. It was something more specific and, in some ways, more disturbing, that the presence of a legitimate-seeming authority structure, combined with a small set of graduated commitments, can produce compliance with instructions that directly contradict a person's own moral judgment, even when that person is experiencing significant distress about what they are doing. The social psychologist Jerry Berger at Santa Clara University, who conducted a partial replication of Milgram's experiments in 2009 with additional ethical safeguards, found remarkably similar compliance rates decades later and across a different cultural moment, suggesting that the phenomenon Milgram identified is not a historical artifact of a particular time and place, but a stable and general feature of human psychology. The mechanism behind this compliance has been analyzed in detail by the social psychologist and Milgram collaborator Alexander Haslam at the University of Queensland, together with Stephen Reicher at the University of St. Andrews. Haslam and Reicher's reanalysis of Milgram's original data and procedures proposes what they call engaged followership, the claim that participants did not comply passively or thoughtlessly, but actively identified with the scientific goals of the experiment as articulated by the experimenter, coming to see their participation as a meaningful contribution to a valuable scientific enterprise rather than as simple obedience to an arbitrary command. This reframing matters because it shifts the explanation for rule following away from a simple story about blind obedience to authority and toward a more complex story about identification with a social role and a social project. People do not simply follow rules because someone told them to. They follow rules because doing so allows them to see themselves as playing a legitimate part in a legitimate enterprise, even when the specific instruction they are following would, viewed in isolation, strike them as wrong. This connects to one of the most important theoretical frameworks in the psychology of rule following, the distinction between compliance and internalization, developed by the social psychologist Herbert Kelman at Harvard University in a landmark 1958 paper. Kelman distinguished between three processes through which people come to conform to social influence: compliance, in which a person conforms to gain a reward or avoid a punishment while privately disagreeing with the rule; identification, in which a person conforms because they want to maintain a relationship with the person or group requesting the conformity; and internalization, in which a person conforms because they have genuinely adopted the underlying value that the rule expresses. Kelman's framework helps explain why rule following and rule agreement can diverge so persistently. Compliance and identification do not require agreement with the content of the rule. They require only that the social costs of violation, whether in the form of punishment, disapproval, or damage to a valued relationship, exceed the costs of compliance. A person can comply with a rule for years, following it consistently and reliably, without ever internalizing the value the rule is meant to express. The legal scholar Tom Tyler at Yale Law School has conducted decades of research on what makes people willing to comply with laws and has documented a finding that has significant implications for how legal and social systems function. Tyler's research on what he calls procedural justice found that people's willingness to comply with laws depends less on their agreement with the specific content of those laws and more on their perception of the fairness of the process through which the laws are made and enforced. People who perceive the legal system as procedurally fair, as treating them with respect, giving them voice, and applying rules consistently, show significantly higher rates of voluntary compliance with laws, even when they disagree with the specific content of those laws, compared to people who perceive the system as procedurally unfair, even when they happen to agree with the specific laws in question. This finding suggests that a large portion of rule following in human societies is not driven by agreement with rules at all, but by trust in the legitimacy of the process that produces and enforces them. This legitimacy-based account of compliance connects to a broader body of research on what the sociologist Max Weber, writing at the turn of the 20th century, called the sources of legitimate authority. Weber distinguished between traditional authority, based on established custom, charismatic authority, based on the personal qualities of a leader, and legal rational authority, based on a system of impersonal rules applied consistently. Weber's framework helps explain why modern human beings, living in societies governed primarily by legal rational authority, are disposed to comply with rules that emerge from a legitimate rule-making process, even when the specific content of those rules would not command their agreement if considered in isolation. The developmental psychologist Elliot Turiel at the University of California, Berkeley, has documented that children as young as 3 or 4 years of age already show a sophisticated understanding of the difference between moral rules, which they judge to be binding regardless of authority, and conventional rules, which they judge to be legitimately alterable by authority. Turiel's research found that children distinguish between rules like it is wrong to hit another child, which they judge would remain wrong even if a teacher said it was permitted, and rules like you must wear a school uniform, which they judge could legitimately be changed by a teacher or a school administration. This early developmental distinction between moral and conventional rules suggests that the human capacity to follow rules while reserving independent moral judgment is not a corruption of an originally pure moral sense, but is present from very early in cognitive development. Human beings appear to be built to distinguish between rules that bind because of their content and rules that bind because of the legitimacy of the process that produced them, and the second category can be followed without agreement in a way that the first, at least ideally, cannot. The anthropologist and political scientist James Scott at Yale University has documented a different and complementary dimension of rule following in his extensive research on what he calls everyday forms of resistance. Scott's ethnographic research on peasant societies found that people who are required to follow rules they disagree with, particularly in contexts of significant power imbalance, rarely engage in open rebellion, but instead engage in what Scott calls the weapons of the weak: foot dragging, feigned ignorance, minor sabotage, and other forms of low-visibility non-compliance that allow the appearance of rule following to be maintained while its substance is quietly undermined. Scott's work suggests that the surface appearance of widespread rule compliance in human societies may obscure a significant undercurrent of partial, strategic, and covert resistance that does not register in formal measures of compliance, but that represents an important channel through which private disagreement with rules is expressed without incurring the costs of open defiance. What the psychology of rule following ultimately reveals is a picture of human social behavior that is considerably more complex than a simple binary between agreement and defiance. Human beings are equipped with a sophisticated set of psychological mechanisms for navigating the gap between what they privately believe and what social order requires of them, mechanisms for identifying with legitimate authority even when specific instructions seem wrong, mechanisms for distinguishing between rules that bind through content and rules that bind through process, and mechanisms for expressing disagreement covertly when open defiance is too costly. The rule you follow today that you do not agree with was not a sign of weakness or a failure of moral courage. It was your social psychology doing something it has done for the entire history of your species, navigating the gap between private judgment and social order in a way that allows large groups of people with genuinely different values to nonetheless function together as a coordinated society. This is not always benign. Milgram's experiments remain a permanent warning about how far this mechanism can be pushed, about the atrocities that ordinary, decent people have been willing to participate in when embedded in a structure of apparently legitimate authority that provided permission and cover for actions that, viewed individually, would have struck each participant as wrong. There is a further dimension of this phenomenon that psychologists have examined with particular care, because it addresses a question that Milgram's experiments raise but do not fully answer. What happens to the moral self of a person who repeatedly complies with instructions they privately reject? The social psychologist Herbert Kelman, whose framework of compliance, identification, and internalization we have already examined, extended his analysis in later work with the political scientist V. Lee Hamilton to study what they called crimes of obedience, cases in which individuals or groups commit acts they would ordinarily regard as immoral because those acts were sanctioned by legitimate authority. Kelman and Hamilton's research on events including the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War found a consistent pattern. Participants in atrocities sanctioned by authority typically did not report having experienced a moral transformation in which they came to believe the atrocity was right. Instead, they reported a kind of moral disengagement, a psychological process through which the ordinary moral evaluation of the act was suspended rather than overridden. The psychologist Albert Bandura at Stanford University developed this concept of moral disengagement into one of the most influential frameworks in the psychology of unethical behavior. Bandura identified several specific cognitive mechanisms through which people who commit or participate in acts they would otherwise regard as wrong manage to do so without experiencing the self-condemnation that would ordinarily follow. Moral justification, in which the harmful act is reframed as serving a higher purpose. Euphemistic labeling, in which the act is described using language that obscures its true nature. Displacement of responsibility, in which the person attributes their actions to the orders or authority of another. Diffusion of responsibility, in which the person's individual contribution to a collective harmful outcome is minimized in their own mind. And dehumanization of the victim, in which the target of the harmful act is perceived as less than fully human and therefore less deserving of moral consideration. Bandura's research found that these mechanisms of moral disengagement operate not as conscious rationalizations constructed after the fact, but as active cognitive processes that shape the person's perception and judgment of the situation in real time, allowing harmful compliance to occur without the internal experience of having done something wrong. This finding is directly relevant to understanding what happens to the moral self during rule following. The mechanisms of moral disengagement provide the psychological cover that allows a person to comply with an instruction that conflicts with their private moral judgment while minimizing the psychological cost of that conflict. The relationship between rule following and identity has been studied extensively by the social identity theorists Henri Tajvel and John Turner, whose work established that human beings derive a significant portion of their sense of self from their membership in social groups, and that this group-based identity can, under certain conditions, come to dominate individual moral judgment. When a person's identity becomes strongly fused with a group or an institution, compliance with the rules and instructions of that group or institution can become experienced not as a departure from one's authentic values, but as an expression of one's group-based identity, which the person may experience as equally authentic or even more authentic than their individual private judgment. The social psychologist William Swann at the University of Texas at Austin has developed the concept of identity fusion to describe the psychological state in which the boundary between individual identity and group identity becomes porous, such that harm to the group is experienced as harm to the self, and the group's goals become experienced as the person's own goals. Swann's research has found that identity fusion is a particularly strong predictor of willingness to engage in extreme behavior on behalf of a group, including behavior that would ordinarily be regarded as violating the person's individual moral standards. This research on moral disengagement and identity fusion helps explain a phenomenon that is otherwise puzzling: why some instances of harmful rule following produce visible distress in the person complying, as Milgram documented, while other instances of harmful rule following are carried out with apparent equanimity or even enthusiasm. The degree of distress appears to depend substantially on the degree to which the mechanisms of moral disengagement have successfully reframed the situation, and on the degree to which the person's identity has become fused with the authority structure requiring the compliance. The organizational psychologist Diane Vaughan at Columbia University has documented a related phenomenon in her extensive study of the Challenger space shuttle disaster, which she analyzes in terms of what she calls the normalization of deviance. Vaughan found that the engineers and managers at NASA who approved the launch decision that led to the disaster were not reckless or indifferent to safety. They had, over a period of years, gradually redefined what counted as an acceptable risk through a series of small, incremental decisions, each of which seemed reasonable in isolation, but which cumulatively normalized a level of risk that would have seemed clearly unacceptable if presented all at once. Vaughan's concept of normalization of deviance connects to rule following in an important way. It suggests that the gap between private judgment and institutional compliance can widen gradually and imperceptibly over time, through a series of small accommodations that individually seem reasonable, but that cumulatively produce a situation in which people are complying with standards that would have struck their earlier selves as clearly wrong. This gradual process is, in many ways, more concerning than the dramatic and immediate compliance that Milgram documented, because it operates below the threshold of conscious awareness and does not produce the visible distress that might otherwise serve as a warning sign. What this body of research collectively suggests is that the relationship between rule following and private moral judgment is not a fixed and stable gap that a person consciously navigates. It is a dynamic and contested boundary, one that can be widened or narrowed by psychological processes of disengagement and identity fusion that often operate outside of conscious awareness, and one that requires active vigilance to maintain in a form that preserves the person's capacity for independent moral judgment. There is one more piece of evidence worth considering because it complicates the picture in an important and hopeful way: the study of the people who did not comply. In every version of Milgram's experiment, and in every historical instance of institutional wrongdoing that researchers have studied since, a minority of people refused to comply, resisted the pressure of authority, or actively worked to undermine harmful institutional directives. Understanding what distinguished these people from the majority who complied has become its own significant area of research. The psychologist Ervin Staub at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, who has spent decades studying the psychology of genocide and mass violence, has documented that resistance to harmful authority is associated with a specific set of psychological characteristics: a strong and stable personal identity that is not overly dependent on group approval, prior experience with moral action that has built what Staub calls a habit of engagement, and the ability to maintain what he calls a pluralistic perspective, an awareness that the authority issuing instructions is not the only legitimate source of moral judgment available. Staub's research on rescuers, individuals who protected potential victims during periods of genocide and mass violence at significant personal risk, found that these individuals were not typically distinguished by exceptional moral reasoning ability. What distinguished them was a pattern of prior small moral actions that had built a kind of psychological momentum, a sense of themselves as people who act on their values, which made it easier to resist the pressure toward compliance when a major test arrived. This finding has practical significance beyond the study of extreme historical cases. It suggests that the capacity to resist harmful or unjustified rule following is not simply a fixed trait that some people have and others lack. It is a capacity that can be built, incrementally, through the practice of noticing the gap between private judgment and social pressure in small, everyday situations, and choosing, when the stakes are manageable, to act in accordance with private judgment rather than simply defaulting to compliance. The rule you follow today that you privately disagree with may be too small a thing to justify open resistance, but the habit of noticing it, of registering clearly to yourself that you are complying rather than agreeing, may be exactly the kind of small moral practice that Staub's research suggests makes a meaningful difference when the stakes eventually become larger. But the same mechanism that makes atrocity possible in its darkest expressions is also the mechanism that makes large-scale human cooperation possible in its most ordinary expressions, the mechanism that allows millions of strangers who disagree about almost everything to drive on the correct side of the road, pay their taxes, wait in line, and generally cooperate with a vast, largely invisible structure of social rules that none of them individually designed, and many of them do not fully endorse. The question the science of rule following ultimately leaves you with is not whether you should follow rules you disagree with. It is whether you know, in any given moment, which kind of rule following you are engaged in, whether the compliance is coming from genuine trust in a legitimate process, or whether it has quietly become something else. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.